Hi, Dr. Bob here to talk to you about portrait photography. This session is on taking better shots of people. I am not going to talk about professional studio portraits where you have multiple lighting sources and you can really control things. That's really for the pros. I'm an amateur, and most people listening to this and watching this will be amateurs as well. So let me show you an example of a portrait photography blunder here. Here's a shot I took several years ago, the younger of my two daughters. And why is this such a poor photo? If you look carefully, you'll see a variety of problems with it. There's some smudging, probably a dirty lens, maybe some oil on it. She's not framed as nicely in the picture as she could be. There's this really ugly outline, the outline effect against the wall. It came from a direct flash, and even if you look closely, you'll see a little bit of red eye. So many things made this a very poor photograph. So how can we do better than this? I'll never be able to go back in time to recreate this photo, so I'm stuck with it. But I'd like to be able to shoot better photographs, and I'm sure you're like I am and want to get better shots of your family. So if you find yourself asking questions like this, this session should be for you. If you say, I paid a lot for my camera, why am I still getting such crummy photos of my family and friends? Or, short of going to a professional photography studio and paying big bucks, how can I get better pictures of my family members at those special events, birthdays, holidays, graduations, and so forth? Or once again, I'm tired of shooting mediocre photographs. What tips will help me take better pictures for my family photo album? If you're in my age group, or for our kids, what will help them take better pictures to post on Facebook, since for them it's passé to actually print your photos and put them in an album. Everything's electronic, it seems, these days. So that's our introduction, and I really want to go through some tips that will help all of us take better pictures for our photo albums. I'm going to present 10 tips for this session. Many of these are drawn from a series of books published by a gentleman named Scott Kelby, who is a professional photographer. He is an expert in Adobe Photoshop and gives seminars all over the country on how to use Photoshop to your advantage. But he did a series of, it's actually 3 books now, volumes 1, 2, and 3 of the digital photography book. And they are excellent, and I strongly recommend them for anyone who's got a serious interest in getting better photographs. You can find some information on Scott at his website, www.scottkelby.com. All right, well, let's delve into the 10 tips. What are they? Well, tip number 1 is shoot solo subjects vertically, and by this I mean a single person. You always want to shoot them vertically. In fact, if you think about printing on your computer, when I print to my computer at home, a screen comes up that looks like this, and you'll notice there's a little section that asks you if you want to print portrait or landscape mode. Landscape would be horizontally, portrait is vertically, and so this is such a well-known tip that you even call any vertical paper orientation portrait mode. So for example, this gentleman, who's part of our photography club at Fairview Hospital, where I delivered this talk in January of 2011, we took a shot of him, but this is a horizontal configuration, not what we want. Instead, we prefer to shoot vertically, fill up the frame with his head, and that's a much better orientation. Now you might ask yourself, well, couldn't I just crop down the horizontal shot and make it vertical at the end? And the answer is yes, you can do that. However, if you're starting with 12 megapixels, as my Nikon D300 camera has, when you do a cropping like that, it basically would take you down to 5.4 megapixels, and you've lost more than half of the pixels, and so you don't have an image of nearly the same quality as if you had shot it vertically to start with. So I would strongly recommend you shoot it vertically rather than crop a horizontal shot. There are some helpful tools if you're going to do frequent shooting in the vertical orientation. If you've got an extra $4,000 or $5,000 laying around, you might want to buy this model, a Nikon D3, which is currently their top line. Well, actually, they've got a D3X now, which is even fancier, but this is close to the top of the line. And you'll notice that not only does it have a standard shutter release button here that you would press with your right index finger as you're positioned behind the camera, but it's also got a shutter release button down on this corner of the camera, which allows you to rotate the camera into a vertical orientation and yet keep your right hand where you're used to having it at the top right side of the camera looking from behind. So the really high-end cameras typically have this feature, but you rarely have it on a lower-end camera. For a lot of the in-betweeners, there is a battery grip that you can purchase that goes into the bottom of your camera and really does a couple of things for you. One is it's got a more powerful battery in it, and it may allow you more frames per second, which is very useful in sports photography, but it also gives you that shutter release so that you can shoot vertically without contorting your arms and your hands. It makes it a lot easier to do. So that's tip number one. There is an exception to this tip, however, and that is if you're shooting profiles. This is not a good look. This is my older daughter, and when you shoot a profile and crop it vertically like this, you really get a sense that they're boxed in. And if you refer to the composition basics lesson in this series, you'll notice it's always good to leave some room ahead of the subject, particularly in a sports setting where you've got a player heading down a court or a field. You leave room ahead of them, room to move into. Same with a child on a bicycle, leave them room to move into. And so when you shoot a vertical shot like this in profile, it makes the person feel like they're boxed in. They're looking right into a wall. And so in this setting, you can make an exception to the rule and shoot horizontally and give some space ahead of them, which leaves a more pleasing photograph. Here's a picture of my wife, shot outdoors in bright sunlight, which can be a problem, and we'll deal with that several tips down the road here. But that makes for a nice profile shot. And here's a picture of my daughter's roommate from college. This one could actually be done either way. She's looking at the camera, so you could crop that vertically, but horizontally is reasonable also. All right, let's move to tip 2. My second tip has to do with the eyes. You want to focus on the eyes. Here's my sister-in-law's eyes. And really 3 aspects to this tip. The first is you want to focus on the subject's eyes. The second is you want to shoot at the subject's eye level. This is especially important for children, by the way. You don't want to shoot down on them where you see them from your vantage point, but you want to get down to their level, which gives you a much better photo. And then finally, you employ the rule of thirds, which is discussed in the composition basics, and typically place the eyes 2/3 of the way up the photograph, if that's possible. Here is a blunder. I took a picture of my 2 daughters, and you'll notice that their eyes are out of focus. And in fact, the focal point of this picture was right in the center, but the center happened to be a chair that was several feet behind them. And this can happen depending on how your autofocus mode is set up. But it's a reason why you might want to center in on one of your subject's eyes, go halfway down with the shutter release button to fix the focus, and then recompose, move the camera to the side where you recompose the image and have both of them in there as shown in this frame, and then shoot the shot. That way you don't get into trouble like I did here with the focal point being something other than what you want to focus on. This is a much better picture where their eyes are in focus, but it's still not a great shot because of the clutter in the background, and it's a little busy for a portrait type photo. And of course you don't need to shoot vertically when you have 2 or more subjects. There, going horizontally is fine. I mentioned shooting at eye level. Here are a few shots of my younger daughter. This is looking down at her, and that's not a good look. Just isn't very flattering. It's much better to shoot at eye level, and this is positioned right at her eye level. Shooting up is probably not as bad, but it's still not as good as shooting at eye level. So especially with children, get down on your knees or sit on your rear end if you need to, and shoot at the same level as your subject's eyes. And then the final portion of tip number 2 here has to do with your rule of thirds. And this is where you would like to position the eyes 2/3 of the way up the photo. Here's a shot I took several years ago of my youngest daughter. Cute picture. And you'll see the background is very out of focus. I've got a narrow depth of field, which is something we will discuss shortly. But the problem is her eyes are right in the middle of the picture. And so this is not a good location for the eyes on a portrait photo. A much better composition would be this, where her eyes are 2/3 of the way up the photo, and we're cropped in tighter on her, which is actually our next tip. So let's go to that. Tip number 3 for portrait photography is to get tight. And by that I mean you don't want to have a lot of headroom around your subject. In this photo, we not only have a big problem with the sunlight, with one side of my French friend Frank's face being dark and the other side being very sunlit, but you have a lot of headroom around him, even a little bit of vignetting up in the top 2 corners from being so wide angle on this shot. So that's not a very good look. Here is a much better look, also in sunlight, but I filled up the frame with the subject's face. And this is a much better portrait than the one on the left. Here is a picture of 2 of my nieces, and you'll notice that they're in nice focus, but it's not a great composition because we've got this gentleman in the background, and we've got a window over here, which maybe distract a little bit from the subjects, which are the 2 girls here. So it would have been better if I had gotten in tighter and gotten a picture like this. Now I did crop it in like this, but as I mentioned before, I lose a little bit of fidelity with this. I've gone from 12 megapixels maybe to 6 or 8 megapixels by cropping in, so I've lost some quality in the shot. But that is a better composition there. Tip number 4 is basically to keep the background simple. A busy background can detract from a good photo. Here's an example of that. This is my oldest daughter's roommate from college, and you'll see that she's up against a busy wallpaper, and also this lamp, which kind of looks like a trophy, appears to be growing out of her head. That is not a good look at all. That's not what you want. You'd like to keep the background simple. Now this particular photograph I was able actually to salvage by cropping in tightly. And you'll notice I even cut off a little bit of the top of her hair, but that's okay. On a portrait photo, in fact, if you go to a lot of CD covers or album covers of musical artists, especially those that have lost their hair, a la James Taylor, you'll see many times they crop in and eliminate the top of the head, and it's no big deal. You don't want to crop off somebody's chin because it really makes them look different, but cropping off the top of the head is not a bad thing at all, and you can do that frequently on photos and actually make them even a little bit better in that way. So keep the background simple. Here's another example. This is our ombudsman at Fairview Hospital, and I took this picture in her office, and you'll notice in the background we've got some photos on a shelf above her head that are actually fairly in focus and again look like they're kind of growing out of her head. So that's not a very good background for a portrait photo. This one over here on the right, this is better. You'll see that she's got some filing in the background and it's a bit out of focus. We've got a shallower depth of field, which helps some. She went and got a studio photo done by Willie Hernandez, who was the Fairview Hospital photographer, And this is the best photo of the three if you want to get a studio version. But try to keep the background simple if you can. Here's one final example. This is my son on the right in the plain t-shirt, and his roommate. Took this, the two of them as they started college recently. And you'll notice in the background there's just a little switch on the wall that's a little distracting. It's generally pretty easy to use Photoshop or whatever program you're using to eliminate that. Now, a problem with this photo, I've got a pretty light beige background, and as we covered in composition basics, with a dark subject you like a light background, with a light subject you like a dark background. Neither light nor dark would work too well with these guys who have dark hair but light t-shirts on, so something in between might have been good, gray perhaps. I actually played with Photoshop and threw in a royal blue background, so that's something you can do, although it generally gives you kind of that cookie cutter look to it, like cardboard figurines pasted onto a photo, so I don't like that too much. It's better to get a good background to start with. So a nice simple one color background is probably the best. Let's move to tip number 5, and that has to do with controlling your depth of field. And this is a little bit of an advanced concept, but let me introduce it by showing a picture of two of my sisters. You'll notice that they are both in focus here, as opposed to this photo where my sister with the blonde hair is in perfect focus, but the one with the reddish hair in the foreground is way out of focus, as is the background. So the one on the right has a much shallower depth of field in terms of what is in focus. The first photo was taken at an f-stop of 5.0, which is kind of a mid-range f-stop. The one on the right was taken with an f-stop of 1.4, which is a very wide open aperture and gives you a very, very shallow depth of field. Let's cover that in a little bit more detail. You can find this in Exposure Basics and in the Advanced Exposure lessons. But the aperture, or f-stop, is technically the lens diaphragm opening inside a camera lens when you press the shutter release button. And so if your aperture is wide open, it lets a lot of light in to the camera in a hurry. If your aperture is closed way down, like the pinpoint here on the right, lets very little light in but gives you very large depth of field. And we'll show that here in the next few slides. Most lenses that we use have multiple different aperture settings from which to choose. Here's an example of a lens that goes from an f-stop of 1.4 down to f22. And you'll notice there are diaphragm components that come together to make that opening smaller. Here on the right end of the picture, on the left end, you see that basically you have no diaphragm segments coming in, so you're wide open at an f-stop of 1.4. And you'll notice that the smaller the number, the more wide open the aperture is. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture is. And that's because this is a reciprocal number. Here's just an example of a guy setting up to a camera or a video camera, and this is true for video as well as for still photography. When you have a small aperture, it gives you a larger depth of field. Here he's shooting at 3 squirrels, and you'll see they're all in focus. In the bottom, the larger aperture gives you a shallower depth of field. So here the middle squirrel is in focus, and the one in the foreground and the one in the background are both out of focus. So this is what we're talking about when we use the term depth of field. How much of your composition is actually in focus versus out of focus. Let me amplify that a little bit and show this photo taken from a website on the bottom of the screen there, you see. The camera is positioned on the right side of the 7 little teddy bears. The focal point is the center bear. And you'll notice at an f-stop of 1.4, the bear in the center is in good focus, but all the other ones are out of focus. So we've got a very shallow depth of field at an f-stop of 1.4. If we go to an f-stop of 4, you'll see that now we've got 3 of the teddy bears in focus at an f-stop of 8, where we're closed down even more. You've got 5 of the 7 in focus, and then finally at an f-stop of 16, we've got not just the center bear in focus, which is the focal point, but also those in the foreground and those in the background. Pretty much everything is in focus when you get down to a pinpoint. And this is in fact why nearsighted people tend to squint by closing down, giving themselves a smaller aperture to their pupil, which brings into focus things in a distance. How do I control the depth of field? Well, it's mainly with the aperture, as we talked about. You'll notice a difference between these two photos and the top one. My daughter and her roommate are in focus, but you have that busy wallpaper in the background. In the bottom picture, I have gone to a shallower depth of field, and you'll see that the wallpaper in the background is fairly fuzzed out, which is actually a nice feature. It draws your attention to the two girls and not so much to the busy background. In the first photo, the f-stop was 8, kind of a mid-range aperture. In the bottom photo, the f-stop was 1.4, which is a very, very wide open aperture given a very shallow depth of field. Let me show two of my son's senior pictures from high school. You'll see the one on the left has a larger depth of field. The reeds and the cattails in the background are at least partially in focus, whereas the picture on the right, where he's standing with his golf club there, shows a shallower depth of field, and you'll see that the woods in the background are fairly out of focus. So that's a more typical portrait photograph, where the subject is in focus and the background is out of focus. What are some techniques to do this? Well, you can use manual settings, which is fairly challenging and for experienced users. For beginners and intermediate users, one of the things that makes this very easy to do is to use aperture priority mode. And this is covered in the advanced exposure modes lesson, but this is a much easier way to do it. You pick your aperture, and then the camera will pick the shutter speed that goes with it. But the aperture priority gives you control over the depth of field of the photograph that you're taking. Many cameras will also have a portrait mode, and that's actually the easiest way to do this. Let me show you the top dial on a typical Nikon digital SLR camera. I believe in this case the D90. You'll see a variety of settings that you can put in. Here the A is for aperture priority, and if you set your aperture, like I said, the shutter speed will be handled automatically by the camera, but the aperture gives you control over depth of field. You can also flip that little dial around and get the portrait mode, which will effectively give you a fairly open aperture and a shallow depth of field, which is the effect that you're after for most portrait photographs. If you've got a point and shoot, this is from Nikon S630 Coolpix, you have many different scene modes, but one of them is always a portrait mode, which again does the same thing. In fact, if you look in the manual of this little camera, it gives a little information on the portrait mode, but it says use this mode for taking portraits in which the main subject stands out clearly. In other words, the subject will be in focus, the background will be out of focus. How do you get that effect? With an open aperture and a shallow depth of field. So the camera will do that for you if you set it in the portrait mode. Okay, let's move on to tip number 6. Choose interesting and flattering poses. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, use some diagonals. Here's a picture of my wife on our 20th anniversary several years ago, and I've always liked this shot. Here's my daughter, also with her head a little tilted. Here's my two younger kids in a pool doing something they enjoy. This is through a flash at dusk on the two of them in a pool, and it made for a nice little composition, I thought. Here's a picture of my nephew with his girlfriend, and one thing that Scott Kelby mentions in his books is that when you shoot a photograph of a subject, it's always a bit more flattering if their shoulders are angled towards you rather than equidistant from the camera. In other words, you don't want to shoot them flat on. You'd rather they be angled. Now, they can turn their head and face exactly towards you, but it's best if the shoulders are a little angled, as they are in this photograph. Here's a good friend of mine who goes on golf trips with me. He loves to referee basketball games, loves the sport, and so I caught a picture of him doing something that he enjoys. You'll see I've got a shallow depth of field as he's in focus, and the fans in the background are way out of focus. What remains to be determined is whether or not he was making an obscene gesture as I took this picture of him. Here's another example of an interesting and flattering pose in the sense that I threw some context into this picture. This was when my son played in the state golf tournament a few Octobers ago. It's always nice to get a picture that gives some context. Here is the Ohio State University golf course, collegiate home of Jack Nicklaus, the greatest golfer ever to play the game. I first saw that sign when I was a medical student at Ohio State, and I felt like I probably should take off my shoes because I was standing on holy ground. Give your portrait some context, and that'll make them more interesting. How about tip number 7? Well, this has to do with bringing groups together, and let me show you some examples here. Here's a picture of me and my 4 siblings along with our parents, and this was taken in South Carolina a few years ago, and it's a typical staged family photo, and it's nice. I shot this off a tripod with a little outdoor flash. But a better photo is this one here, where my wife was having a birthday, and so our 3 kids and I, we all got together. And you'll notice how our heads are kind of all bunched together in this photograph. That makes for a warmer composition when you bring the people together in the photograph. Here's my 2 older children with their heads together. Makes for a very cute little picture. Or my sister and her husband, gives you that warm, intimate look, bringing their heads together. All right, tip number 8 has to do with the sunlight, and you want to work around direct sunlight, and by that I mean work around it. Direct sunlight is not your friend. It creates some problems when you're trying to shoot outdoor photographs when the sun is bright, and the reason is it produces a great amount of contrast between the light and the dark sections of your photograph. For example, here's a good friend of mine with his wife and her grandkids. You'll see that the sun is shining fairly brightly, and it gives her a very two-tone face, which is not the effect that we're looking for. So that's not so good. How about this photograph? Well, this is a little bit better, but you'll notice that my friend Gail here still has a two-toned chin here, so nice to do better than this in bright sunlight. So what are some approaches to get away from photos that come out like this? Well, there are several. One is to shoot at dawn or at dusk, which are probably the best times to get photographs outdoors in general. You can wait for some clouds to come overhead and then snap your pictures. And in Ohio, we have plenty of clouds, but in other places of the country, you may be waiting for a long time. Shooting in the shade is useful. It may require that you open the aperture a little bit more or have longer shutter speeds to get to proper exposure, but it's often better than shooting in the direct sunlight where you have such wide ranges of contrast. You can diffuse the sunlight, and there are professional pieces of equipment for this to place between where the sun is coming down and your subject. You can actually do this on a makeshift budget with a sheet that's stretched between the sunlight and your subject, and that's something you might want to do if you're getting important photos, but is a bit of a hassle. So you can use outdoor fill-in flash to give you a better balance between the light and dark sections of your photo. And then the final approach is to don't shoot with the sun over your shoulder. In other words, pointing directly at your subjects. And I'll show you a few examples of that. In terms of waiting for the clouds, here's a picture of my son with his date for a formal event, taken with just a little point and shoot by my wife. This was not so good. Again, she's got a two-tone nose there with some bright sun on part of it, and then the rest of her face is fairly dark. By simply waiting for some clouds, you get much better balanced lighting on the two of them. So that's just a little point and shoot, but that's a much better picture than the one on the left. Another approach is to use fill-in flash. Here is my daughter at her college graduation with her roommate, and it was a bright sunny day outside, nothing I could do about that, but in order to kind of even up the lights and the darks, I just threw some flash at them and brought out their faces much more uniform than they would have been without the flash, and so that did a nice job there. Here's a picture of my sister and her husband and family from several years ago, and this was taken at dusk on a cruise ship, and I just threw some fill-in flash, brightened them up, and it made for a nice effect. As far as the location of the sun, here's a picture of my daughter out in my driveway with the sun behind me pointing directly at her. And you'll notice that if you do that, the subjects will often squint or shade their eyes like she's doing. Not the best angle to shoot. You can actually shoot with the sun behind your subject if the sun is actually not in the photograph itself, and it gives kind of a halo effect, real bright effect on their hair behind their head. Problem with this is often you'll get a little artifact. That's called lens flare, and so it's a problem when you shoot with the sun directly behind the subject, although it's not a bad look. Here's with the sun at 90 degrees, and this is a cute photograph. I'm sorry I didn't control my depth of field very well here because the trees in the background are too much in focus. But one thing you'll notice on this photograph is that there's a really harsh shadow line along her neck here, and a little bit too much contrast between the light and the dark. So what can I do about that? Well, I threw in just a little bit of fill-in flash. This is just from the pop-up, not a separate flash unit, but just a little pop-up on the camera. But you'll see how it really lightened that up and lessened the contrast between the shaded portion of her neck and the sunlit portion of her neck. So that's probably the best of the four photographs in how to deal with sun location. Tip number 9 is to diffuse light indoors whenever you can. Now, probably the best light for a photograph indoors is ambient light, typically coming through a north-facing window where you'll never get direct sunlight, at least in the northern hemisphere. And this provides excellent softness. The softer the light, the more flattering it is on your subject. And so how do you diffuse light? Well, there are lots of different ways to do it. You can use red eye reduction also to try to take away some of the red eye that you get in the subject. But ideally you want to diffuse the light, and here are some little diffusers made by a fellow named Gary Fong. But even with a little point and shoot, the smaller the light source, which you'll have a very small light source on a point and shoot camera, you get very harsh lighting, and by throwing just this little plastic diffuser in there, it really softens down the light, and you can see a little example of that in the Flash Photography Basics module. The center one shows a pop-up flash diffuser, again to kind of effectively broaden your light source, and then even on an external flash unit, by throwing a diffuser on it, you cut the light intensity a little bit, but you also soften it tremendously and get a much better look. So when you can, diffuse the light indoors. The other thing that you can do is bounce your flash, and this is true only if you've got a separate flash unit that you can point off the ceiling. Here is an example of a direct flash, and this is courtesy of a gentleman named Roy Galitz in Israel. I got this from his website and with his permission. If you shoot this little kangaroo, I guess, direct on, you get that ugly shadow against the wall, the little outline look, and it's not a very nice photo. But if you take the flash and bounce it off of the ceiling, like you would in this schematic, here's what you get. No more shadows, and you get much better lighting. The floor, which is blue here, gets nicely lit up. Or even alternatively, you could bounce off the wall here and light up one half of the little stuffed animal's side as opposed to the other half, and that's what they call Rembrandt lighting, which is how Rembrandt did most of his paintings. but either of those on the bottom is much better than the direct flash straight ahead. So if you have a flash unit capable of bounce flash, I recommend trying this. It works best off a white colored ceiling that's no more than 10 or 12 feet high, but it really does give you a nice effect. And then finally, tip number 10, engage and relax your subjects. And these are tips from Scott Kelby. He advises against the old 1, 2, 3, shoot protocol. He says people typically then, right as you go to 3, will pose and give a little cheesy smile, and it really doesn't come out looking that good. Instead, he recommends engaging your subjects in conversation, get them talking between themselves, laughing. If you have a family comedian, like my brother is for our family, you can get everybody laughing by getting the comedian to tell stories, and you get a much more natural shot that way. Another thing that Scott Kelby recommends, and this is a bit Machiavellian in the sense that the ends justify the means, but he'll tell the subjects not to pose yet. He's just taking test shots, to evaluate the lighting and so forth, when in fact he's actually using those as real shots. So that's a little bit of deception, but Scott Kelby recommends it, and who am I to argue differently? So that's a technique that he says many pros use actually to get better shots than when people actually try to pose for the picture and look somewhat artificial. So to review, the 10 tips for portrait photography are as follows. Number 1, shoot your subjects vertically, at least a solo subject. Secondly, focus on the eyes, and we said not only focus on the eyes, but shoot at eye level of your subject and then try to position the eyes 2/3 of the way up the photograph. Third, get in tight on your subject, fill up the frame with their faces. Number 4, keep the background simple. Number 5, control the depth of field by using aperture priority or manual modes or the portrait mode that is present on most cameras, except the super high-end ones where they expect you to know how to handle those things. Number 6, choose interesting and flattering poses, or bring a little context in with a sign of where you are. Number 7, bring groups together, especially bring their heads together on the pictures. Number 8, work around direct sunlight. Try to avoid shooting people in bright sunlight where you're going to get too much contrast for your liking. Number 9, when you're indoors, try to diffuse the light. You can bounce flash to get a better effect, or use some type of diffuser to soften the light so that your small light source effectively gets translated into a larger light source and brings the light rays onto your subject in a softer manner. And finally, number 10, engage and relax your subjects. So that's it. 10 tips for better portrait photographs. And from my family to yours, good luck on taking better portraits.